There's almost no gun that was more mass-produced than the British Sten during World War II. By the end of the war, the Commonwealth nations had managed to build over 4.5 million of them. It was cheap, lightweight, and was carried into some of the deadliest battles in the Pacific and European theatre. But that scale of production came with a massive catch, and all across Normandy and Warsaw, thousands of soldiers and partisans started dying due to 4 brutal flaws that made the Sten genuinely terrible. So today we're explaining each flaw one by one. The single worst design decision on the entire gun was the magazine. The Sten used a side-feeding double-stack, single-feed 32-round box magazine, and the British more or less copied the layout directly from the captured German MP-28, which was itself a proven and relatively reliable design. But the problem was that the British copied it imprecisely, and then made it significantly worse during mass production. At the top of the magazine, 2 tiny metal tabs that hold the bullets in place before firing were made from very thin, cheap steel, and were manufactured so inconsistently that you couldn't count on them being the right size or shape. And because Sten production was spread across dozens of different workshops and subcontractors scattered across Britain, quality control varied enormously between batches and between facilities. So some magazines fed reliably through hundreds of rounds, and some would cause a stoppage on the second round, and there was no straightforward way of knowing which was which until the gun was already in your hands in a firefight and the moment had already passed. But it got considerably worse than that. Soldiers loaded these magazines by pressing rounds down with their thumb against the spring, and if they loaded the full 32 rounds, the spring tension became so high that the gun would frequently fail to feed at all, the bolt stripping the top round and jamming it against the feed lips instead of chambering it cleanly. Most experienced Sten users learn to load only 28 or 30 rounds as a workaround, which is a major inconvenience when you're supposed to have 32 rounds available and you're counting every one of them. There was also a second problem with the magazine that was more subtle but just as damaging in combat. The magazine housing, the slot the magazine plugged into on the left side of the receiver, was the only real forward grip available on the weapon. There was no foregrip or handguard, so as soldiers went prone or were moving quickly through rubble, they would naturally grab the magazine itself for control, which was the only logical thing to grip. And that slight downward pressure from the support hand was enough to partially unseat the magazine from the housing and cause a feed failure mid-fire at exactly the moment they were face to face with the enemy. British infantrymen at Anzio in early 1944, where Commonwealth and American forces spent 4 months pinned in one of the most grinding stalemates of the Italian campaign with around 30,000 Allied casualties, reported magazine failures as a consistent problem in the kind of short-range trench and building fighting the Sten was ostensibly designed for. The magazine was the solution to mass production economics, and as a manufactured object it was cheap and fast to produce. But the cost of that approach was a feeding system that soldiers across every theatre learned through hard experience to distrust. But this was somehow not even the worst part of the gun. The Sten operated on a simple open bolt blowback system, which meant that when you pulled the trigger, the bolt slammed forward under spring pressure, stripped a round from the magazine, chambered it, and fired it all in one continuous motion. Simple systems are generally reliable, and the principle behind the blowback action was sound and well understood by 1940. But the Sten's execution of that system was rough enough to create 2 completely separate jamming problems, happening for completely different reasons, which made the gun unpredictable in a way that a single consistent fault never quite is. The first was environmental contamination, because the Sten was built from roughly finished stamped steel with deliberately wide tolerances, so grit and debris often worked their way into the mechanism constantly during field use. The ejection port was large and completely exposed to whatever conditions the soldier happened to be operating in, and there was no dust cover of any kind fitted to early production marks. Soldiers in North Africa reported their Stens jamming repeatedly in the sandy desert environment, with residue falling into the action during movement and causing the bolt to bind before it completed its cycle. In the Pacific, the problem was the complete opposite, where the humidity and tropical moisture alone was enough to cause the bolt to corrode and stiffen inside the receiver after just a few days in the field, without a full disassembly and clean, and keeping a Sten properly maintained in a jungle environment required effort that the operational tempo rarely allowed. The second jamming problem was more mechanical and harder to solve through better maintenance habits, but some Sten marks were better than others, and it would be unfair not to acknowledge that. The Mark II was the most widely produced variant overall, but the Mark III, which made up a large share of the later production runs, was constructed almost entirely from 2 steel tubes welded together with minimal machining, and was consistently the worst performer for both contamination and cycling reliability. Resistance fighters, receiving Sten supply drops across occupied France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, had no way of knowing which mark they were receiving or what condition it had survived the drop-in. And for partisans conducting operations where a jam meant capture or execution by the SD or the Gestapo, that uncertainty was not a small thing to carry. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, the gun had a completely different problem. The Sten's safety mechanism was not a safety mechanism in any meaningful functional sense, and on the earliest marks there was no dedicated safety component at all. The only method available to make the gun safe was to rotate the bolt handle upward into a small notch cut into the side of the receiver, which was designed to hold the bolt in the rearward cocked position and prevent it from moving forward under spring pressure. The problem was that the notch wore down quickly with use, especially on guns from the lower quality production batches or that had already seen extended field service without replacement. If that notch gave way, or if the gun was dropped onto a hard surface from any height, or if it took a sharp knock against the frame of a vehicle or the edge of a doorway or a piece of rubble, the bolt could break free and slam forward under full spring tension, chambering around and firing it, with no one touching the trigger and no warning to anyone nearby. This was not an occasional edge case that happened to unusually unlucky soldiers. It happened in training, on transport vehicles, during river crossings, and in the field with enough regularity that British Army technical memos from 1942 specifically and formally warned soldiers about the risk and detailed handling procedures intended to reduce, but nothing could eliminate it. There are documented accounts of soldiers in Normandy being shot by the man directly in front of them when a Sten snagged on webbing or kit during a movement, and the gun discharged backward into the column behind. Polish fighters using Stens during the Warsaw Uprising in August and September of 1944, where an estimated 50,000 civilians and combatants were killed across 63 days of fighting, in which the Germans methodically destroyed the city block by block with armor and demolition charges, reported that accidental discharges were a consistent danger inside buildings and during movement through rubble, at times posing as immediate a risk as the German forces on the other side of the wall. The Mark V, introduced in 1944 and built to a noticeably higher standard than the earlier Marks, did add a proper crossbolt safety as part of a broader set of improvements, but by that point millions of the earlier variants were already distributed across multiple theaters and were not being recalled or replaced. So for the majority of the war, the soldier carrying a Sten was carrying a loaded firearm with no reliable way to make it safe between engagements. Most of them understood that, and most of them developed their own handling habits to manage a risk that the designers had simply not adequately solved. And somehow when you combined accidental discharges, constant jams, and a magazine that was far from reliable, it created one bigger issue. Because the Sten was specifically designed to be manufactured by anyone with access to basic metalworking equipment, the standard of individual guns varied enormously depending on where and when each batch was produced. The British government subcontracted production to small engineering workshops, converted garages, and light manufacturing firms that had never built a firearm of any kind before, and the results directly reflected the experience of whoever happened to be making each batch that month. Welds on the receiver were inconsistent across production runs, and some were poor enough that the body of the gun would crack along the weld line under sustained automatic fire, particularly on the Mark III, where the entire receiver was essentially two steel tubes joined by welding alone. Barrels were not always properly rifled during the faster production periods, which affected what little accuracy the gun had at anything past about 50 meters, though the open bolt design and the inherent looseness of the action meant the Sten was never built with precision in mind, regardless of barrel quality. Some guns arrived at unit level with components that simply did not fit together correctly, requiring soldiers or unit armorers to file down parts or force assemblies into alignment in the field with whatever tools happened to be available. The finish on most Stens was raw phosphate or bare metal with a thin surface coating of grease, which offered almost nothing in terms of corrosion protection. And during the autumn and winter campaign through Northwest Europe in 1944 and 1945, guns operating in the Belgian and Dutch rain and mud would begin corroding within days of sustained use. And yet soldiers found ways to make the Sten work in spite of every one of those problems. Experienced men carried spare magazines preloaded to 28 rounds and marked the reliable ones with tape or scratches, so they knew which to reach for in the dark. They kept the bolt handle notch wrapped or blocked for transport to stop it working loose and jarring forward. They stripped and cleaned the action every opportunity they had, sometimes by feel alone in the dark before a dawn operation. British paratroopers at Arnhem in September 1944, where around 1,900 men were killed and over 6,000 captured in 9 days of fighting against SS armored divisions in and around a Dutch town that was never supposed to hold that long, used Stens almost exclusively in the building-to-building fighting in Arnhem itself, where the gun's compact size and rate of fire gave it real advantages in tight spaces that offset its reliability problems somewhat. The gun was also dropped in very large quantities to resistance organizations across France, Belgium, Denmark, and the Netherlands, and because it could be broken down quickly and hidden inside a rolled coat, beneath floorboards, or inside a hollowed-out loaf of bread, it became one of the most practically significant weapons of the underground war across occupied Europe. So the Sten was not a good gun, and nobody at the time who used one regularly argued otherwise. But it was the gun Britain could actually produce, in the quantities it actually needed, at a moment when the alternative was putting soldiers in the field with bolt-action rifles and hoping the war stayed at range. And in that very narrow practical sense, for every stoppage and every accidental discharge, and every magazine that failed at the worst possible moment, it did exactly what it was built to do. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing.